So I sometimes read people saying, oh, premium is so expensive, and I get where the misconception is coming from, because there are some expensive cards. However, there's also various reasons why that's not true. Today we're gonna go into one of the many reasons, and that is ZEROTH dragons and progenitor dragons. Now, when these first came out, hell broke loose, because you were paying essentially anywhere between 70 to 100, maybe 110 bucks for one card. And that's outrageous, you know? It still is outrageous. Like, one card, why? They were pretty impactful back then, at least some of them. But over time, these have gotten less and less necessary. And so today, I kind of wanted to explore which clans don't actually need their ZEROTH dragon, and to a lesser extent, their progenitor dragon even. So if you're trying to build a deck, and you're trying to stay budget, do you actually need to buy these? Let's go over it. So, we'll do this by nation. We start with United Sanctuary. So first of all, we have Royal Paladin. Now, Royal Paladin, we're gonna always assume at least some of the most viable decks. Like, you know, we're not gonna be talking about Jewel Knights here. So for Royals, I would say the most legit deck, let's say, is the Blaster Blade deck. And in this deck, I would say Ultima is relatively necessary. You know, Twin Sword is a really strong stride. Gansolot is a really strong stride. Alfred Saver is a really good stride. But Ultima still confirms you that instant Flogel with crits on Blaster Blade, multiple restand kind of play. So this is one of the few where I will say it's probably a good bet to grab Ultima. If I had to put a number on it, like necessity-wise, I would put it at like a 7. You know, a 7 out of 10 of necessity. Now, for the Progenitor Dragon Agnos, I don't think that's necessary, really. I would put it at like a 2 out of 10 of necessity. Is it cool to have? Sure. But like, if you don't want to spend, what is it, 20 bucks, 10 bucks? I don't know. If you don't want to spend that, I don't think it's that necessary. It'll come up maybe once every 50 games or something. Next up, Oracle Think Tank. Do you need Ultima for Oracle Think Tank? I don't think so. If you're building Itchy Tom, it's cool to have. Like, I know of Mohamed winning France, his finals. He used Ultima, I believe, to win. He G-guarded into it because that was his singular win con against Neo Nectar. I think Neo wasn't playing PGs, and so that was like a quick win, the only way for him. But in general, it's really not all that necessary. Again, this is one of those things where you're gonna see it maybe once every 40, 50 games. If you want to be budget with OTT, with your Ichitom combos, that is more than enough finisher-wise, I would say. And so I would put that at like a 3 out of 10 of necessity. Generally, if you have gone through all of your Ichikishimas, you've helped your opponent keep their PGs because Ichi has been turning those off, and so guarding 3 attacks isn't all that hard for them. As for the Progenitor, I don't think it's necessary either. OTT relies on its big hand, and Agnos just doesn't really help with that. You go -5 to draw 3. Ichi already draws you 2 cards anyway, so it's really not all that great in there. Next up, Angel Feather. Ultima, in my opinion, is pretty necessary in Angel Feather. The decks I've seen for premium Angel Feather are usually reliant on an Ultima loop. So here I would definitely put it at like an 8 out of 10 of necessity. This is a deck where you'll want it. I'm sure there's people with win cons in this deck that doesn't revolve around Ultima, but it does feel relatively necessary. As for Agnos, I wouldn't say it's the most necessary, maybe a 4 out of 10. Then Shadow Paladin. Ultima, I don't think is necessary. Again, we're talking about Luard here, and Morfessa is just so much better 99% of the time, and I'm like, why would you even run Ultima? I personally cut it out of my deck a while ago. It just doesn't come up. Whenever you wonder like, do I Morfessa or do I Ultima? It's like, Morfessa, it's just better. You can't really do Dagda plays as easily on Ultima, unless you're fine with losing your power afterwards. So you can't do it before your Vanguard swings, because you'll be shuffling, and after your Vanguard swings, the new column you call is usually small. And again, it's not going to be swinging with crit, it's not going to be swinging with Morfessa's guard restrict, so Ultima, not a really big fan of it in that deck. Then Agnos, you can stride into it for free of Luard, which is really cool. You don't require the Progenitor cost, but again, if you're going into Agnos, you've probably lost already. So again, you want to go into Morfessa or the Drag Abyss if you want to build a hand. Maybe Ogma is sometimes even an option. Before Agnos, even in my opinion. The only time where I can see you going Agnos is like, oh, I just got Bummer so hard, I have 0 hand, Agnos is going to draw me some cards because I have an empty hand, and that's that. But it feels very, very iffy. So Agnos maybe a 2 out of 10 of requirement. Gold Paladin. This deck needs Ultima. End of story. Sure, there is the GB8 loop. We've seen that in the World Finals, the Premium World Finals, where Simon won with a GB8 loop rather than Ultima against Granblue. That was cool, but in general, the Ezel deck still relies on Ultima to win its game, so that's going to be like a 9 or a 10 out of 10 of necessity in my opinion. Agnos isn't necessary at all in my opinion. It was really cool to counter Nubatama sometimes, but we've seen plenty of Ezel decks top and win major events without any Agnos in there, so not necessary at all. Genesis has a few decks. You have the decks relying on Amaruda to win, and you have the Wiseman loops. Neither of those feel really reliant on Ultima, maybe a 4 or a 5 out of 10. I don't know if there's actually a Wiseman loop using Ultima to stack stuff on Wiseman and then go off. I think Mohammed told me about that at one point actually. He's like an OTT Genesis main. But again, I don't see them being too necessary, maybe a 4 or a 5 out of 10. And then for Agnos, doesn't feel necessary at all, maybe a 1 out of 10. So your progenitor really, across the board in this nation, isn't that useful. And then your Zeroth, you know, Ultima is probably one of the best Zeroth dragons, because you've noticed I've said it's necessary in 3 of these decks, which is a big number. You're gonna notice that in all the other nations, that's just not the case. So then Dragon Empire, we have Kagero. Drachma isn't all that great in this deck. Generally, Kagero will win either by just on your first ride smacking with crits and restanding instantly, or your Dumjit stride with crits, restanding, or your Legion turn with a double restand. And none of that is Drachma. Drachma is really mediocre compared to the things you can actually do with this deck. So I personally wouldn't run it in there. Like, sure, if you have the room, you have the budget, it's like an extra option, but it doesn't feel necessary at all. Then we have Gilgal, the progenitor. It's a pretty good card, but its prime was really when Ezel was the best deck in the format, because you could wipe boards like that and that felt really good. With Ezel no longer being the threat as it once was, I'm not sure how good Gilgal really is. Kagero already retires quite a bit anyway, so I would say maybe Gilgal is like a 4 out of 10 in this deck, and Drachma is like a 1. Nubatama. This deck needs Drachma. That's gonna be a 9 out of 10 for me. Reason being, usually use Jamio Congo to limit your hand and then attack you with, you know, some of their not so great strides. However, when they get to a Jamio Congo, which puts your hand to 4, and then Drachma, which further limits that, that hurts a lot. So this is where Drachma actually shines. This is the one deck, in my opinion, where you actually want it. It's going to be a 9 out of 10 or a 10 out of 10 of necessity. Gilgal, it's kind of similar situation, you know. The way people counter Jamio Congo is by calling cards from their hand to field, because they're like, well, I'm going to have to discard them anyway. But by doing so, they now have a field that you can blow up. So by combining Gilgal and Jamio Congo, you take away a lot of resources and lines of play from your opponent. Sometimes you can't Mukuro them, and that's when you need the Gilgal. So again, I'll have to put both of them, maybe Gilgal at like a 7 or an 8 out of 10 of necessity, but then Drachma at a 9 or a 10. For Tachi, Drachma feels pretty mediocre because all of your power really comes from either your 2 Dogma strides, 3 Dogma strides, damn, there's a lot of big T-Rexes from those strides essentially, or if you're just on Anger Blader, killing people like that. Tachi really doesn't get too much out of Drachma in my opinion. And then Gilgal, same story, you know. Maybe you want to run it. I would put Drachma at like a 2 out of 10. Gilgal at maybe like a 3 out of 10. The free stride can be cool, but it's so slow when you could be doing so much more. Next up, Murakumo. Usually the Mura loop. Technically that works with Drachma, doesn't it? that is an option. I've heard of people like using Drachma to nuke Honolis to then Mura loop or something like that. I'm not really familiar enough with them. Maybe I'll put it at a 5 for that reason, but usually Mura loop will win without any of that weird stuff, let's say. And then for the progenitor, again, doesn't feel all that necessary. Maybe like a 4, maybe like a 3. But again, Mura isn't like the biggest deck in premium, so it's pretty hard to say. I'm sure there's plenty of stuff that can be solved further in that deck, and maybe someone finds like something spicy, but overall doesn't feel too necessary. Next up, Narukami. Again, not one of the best decks in premium at all. Still, I feel like you really want to be doing bigger stuff than Drachma can do in this clan. Same for the progenitor. I feel like you're not really in these slower decks already with the auto win when your opponent is at 5 damage. You really need to be using a stride that actually gets them to that 5. So I don't think those 2 strides do too much for this clan either. Next up, Stargate Nova Grappler. So Stark is a weird one here. It doesn't help anything the Nova Grappler deck does. However, if you've lost your entire hand and field and you're like, well, this is my last ditch effort, sure. But if you're that far into the game, that means you've busted. So your hand is huge. Or you've used the other 2 Victor strides, so your opponent should already be dead. Nova's biggest issue is winning that grade 2 game because they have a really hard time doing that. And so I just don't feel like Stark does much. But on the other hand, if you are then in that last ditch situation, it does give a bit of a different playstyle option than what you're used to. Usually you are very rearguard reliant, and now suddenly you have a restanding Vanguard, double restanding Vanguard actually. So, I'll put the ZEROTH at a 5. I'll put the progenitor at like a 4. Again, they don't feel too necessary because generally you really want to be going to the Victor strides as well as the Bustard, which just do so much more for the deck and synergize so much more than these other 2. Then Dimension Police. So Stark very often feels like just a worse X-Gallop because you're already restanding for massive numbers. But sometimes it can be cool to pump up a Stark that then swings 3 times, maybe with a Force 2 under it, even if you were able to go like that. So that is actually pretty decent, I would say. Now, Different Fight, I'm sure, has like even more detailed opinions on that, but I do feel Stark is pretty good in the DP deck. I'll put it like a 6 or a 7 of necessity. Generally, though, X-Gallop is gonna be your big boy. As for the progenitor, I feel you really don't have time for him in this deck, and so I will be putting it at a 1. Then we have Link Joker. Now, Link Joker, the big issue is you basically have 3 decks in this clan. You have Messiah, you have Chaos, and you have the leader. Chaos just stalls, but it stalls towards nothing. So maybe it's pretty cool to have a Stark then, because you're stalling and stalling and stalling, and maybe after a while that can be your kill, maybe. So I'll put it at a 6. But then the leader has restanding Vanguards, but better. And Messiah, if you're not striding Messiahs, you're not reaching your discard Messiah, and that's like your win con. So I definitely don't think Stark is like the best in these. And again, if you're striding your progenitor, you're not striding a Messiah, so you're not getting closer to your win con. So again, not too big of a fan of those cards in here. Now, if you have them, cool. Stark is always going to be that cheesy, extra weird win con, but it's very, very, very rare. Next up, Dark Zone. We start with Spike Brothers. Do you need Dust in Spike Brothers? I would say no. Sure, this clan can kind of multi-attack, but it's usually reliant on your stride skills, and your real win con is GB8 anyway. You are going to be stalling towards GB8, or you are doing the good end plays. But if you're doing those, again, Dust does absolutely nothing for you. The Progenitor is pretty cool for me though, but again, that card doesn't flip, so you're not really helping yourself with the GB8. But it's a nice to have. I would maybe put Formido at like a 4 and then the Dust at like a 1. Then we have Dark Irregulars. Usually, we're gonna assume this is a Gusty deck. Gusty decks don't have time for Dust. Usually it will be Gusty and you win, or Gusty Bladermouse and you win. Anything beyond that just feels iffy. The Progenitor can be cool if you're being damage denied, but this deck usually also runs Bobo to counter damage denial. So I'll put Dust at a 1. I've tested this deck extensively. I think over 100 games. I've gone into it once, some weird fringe situation, but it really, really doesn't come up. And then the Progenitor, a bit more, but still nowhere near close, like maybe once in 30 games. I don't think either of them are that good. I would rather have G-Guardian options in this deck. Next up, Pale Moon. Now, Pale Moon has quite some builds. If you're going for the Songster loop, both Formido and Dust are a 0. Straight up zeros, you do not want them. Because Dust does not win you the game because you won't have the Songster skill live. And the Progenitor is not a Cray Elemental and doesn't flip a Cray Elemental. So again, doesn't help you whatsoever. You don't want free striding in this deck. You want to be able to flip Cray Elementals to then do your loop. In the Alice loop, Dust is a really good card. The Progenitor is not a really good card. So if you're doing Alice loop, I would put Dust at like a 6 or a 7 of necessity. Maybe an 8 even. It is a good card for this deck. But again, the Progenitor isn't going to do much for you, so it's not all that necessary. Next up, Gear Chronicle. Now, Gear Chronicle has a lot of tiny pokes, and so it may be alright with Dust, but generally the deck will still get way more out of the other strides it has access to. So I'll put Dust at a 5. It's definitely more useful than in Spikes, but it's still nowhere near as good as like the other things it can do usually. Progenitor, cool to have. Again, doesn't do all that much for the clan. It does, however, in my opinion, lack a really good first stride. Sure, you can do some history shenanigans with Time Leap already, but most of that still feels relatively iffy. Next up, Magallanica, we have Granblue, my baby. Megiddo is pretty necessary. Sure, the deck can win on Obadiah, it can win on Nitros, it can win on the GB8 even, because you can recycle your G-Guards with Greed Shade and get there pretty fast, but a really strong win con is still the Megiddo plus Skull Dragons combo, and so I will put Megiddo at an 8 out of 10 here because it is quite useful. But if you can't afford it, you know, you can still win plenty of games on Obadiah, stuff like that. Then we have the Progenitor. Balan Arena's big issue in Granblue is that you have no revival beyond your Vanguard skill and your Stride skill, both of which you do not have access to when you're on Balan Arena. So sure, you have a huge hand, but you have no units whatsoever to really get value out of this. Maybe some future cards in future sets will fix that, but for now, Balan Arena doesn't feel like a very threatening turn on Granblue, because you'll be swinging with a 9 or a 14k and then trying to guard break when you could be swinging with Skull Dragons and doing all of these kinds of combos and plussing. It can be useful against control matchups, against stuff like Ghidorah and Link Joker, but you know, if you can't afford a Balan Arena right now, it's really no big deal. But I think it's actually pretty cheap. I think it's like 15 bucks or something. I don't know, I may be way off. Most progenitors are really cheap. But yes, the Zeroth Dragon is relatively necessary in this deck. Then we have Bermuda Triangle. Now there's quite some builds for this deck. Megiddo doesn't feel the most necessary in quite some of them, but then if you're playing Rivière, it's pretty cool. Essentially, Megiddo gets better the more force markers your deck can make. So if it can make quite a bit, then it is pretty cool to have, but if it can't, then you know, it doesn't really matter as much. As for the Progenitor, that is necessary in the Harmony Melody build we saw do well in BSF Australia last year. You know, WCC went in with this really weird Melody Harmony build, and that could use Balan Arena to great effect. So in there, I would definitely say you have to be running that card, but Megiddo, maybe not so much. I'll put Megiddo at a 4, and I'll put the Progenitor at a 7. In that specific deck. Next up, Aqua Force. So Aqua Force can do multi-attacks already, but the multi-attacks are really, really small. And so Megiddo generally gets shut down by a single defensive trigger and doesn't even net you that many more attacks. So Megiddo, a big maybe. Valios will already be giving you that kind of multi-attack whilst also putting your opponent stuck at 11. And we have Balan Arena. There are people abusing this a bit by running loads of draw triggers and stuff like that to try and break guard while poking. But again, this does get shut down by a singular defensive trigger. So the Progenitor is fine if you're building for it, but not all that insane. I'll be putting both of them at like a 3. Like if you're trying to build Aqua Force and you want to be budget, Alexandros and Valios are really cheap because of Revival Collection and Premium Collection, and 90% of the time will get you there anyway. Then the Zoo Nation Mega Colony. This deck needs Zoa. This deck, again, just like Link Joker, is just stalling and floodgating to then eventually get to a win con. But neither of these clans have win cons. The only win con Mega Colony has access to, really, is Zoa, the combo of Antlion, Zoa, maybe add a Phantom Black. And so in this deck, in order to eventually win the game instead of losing to time, you do want the Zoa for this deck. The Progenitor Megaloma, not so much. It doesn't really do all that much. If you're forced into a Megaloma, that means you're not actually floodgating your opponent's board with Ghidorah anymore or an Optyrannus or something like that, and so you're probably gonna lose. So I'll put Zoa at like an 8 or 9, maybe a 10 even, and the Progenitor at like a 2. Then Great Nature, Zoa. Once again, this deck doesn't need Zoa, but it can actually do a lot with it. You know, the Rhino plus Monoculus Tiger combo is a pretty big deal, and while the deck can definitely win on something like a Belarl or sometimes even first tried on a Managarmr, you still really want access to that alternative win condition, in my opinion, especially because you're running Rhino anyway, and having more 10k grade 1s is also really good to make this deck less fragile, so you kind of want to be running some Monoculus Tiger anyway as well, so you might as well pick up the Zoa. It's not as required as, let's say, the Zoa in Mega Colony, because Mega Colony has no win con beyond that, but you do kind of still want it. So I'll put this at like an 8 of necessity, while the Mega Colony had like a 9 or something like that. The Progenitor in this deck doesn't really do all that much unless you're doing the combo where you're dealing yourself damage with Almirage plus Bunta to then stop your opponent's turn from happening. That's a funny cheese, but it's also not that great once your opponent knows what you're doing. So I'll put the Progenitor at a 4. purely because of that combo, but if that combo didn't exist, it would be a 0. Next up, Neo Nectar. Zoa feels extremely unnecessary in this deck. I'll put it at a 2 out of 10 of necessity. You're going to be winning on Katrina. On the first Katrina, you will probably win. On the second Katrina, you will very, very definitely win. And on the third, I'm asking the question, why are they not dead? Zoa is usually just a single PG GG. So, okay, sure, maybe all your Katrinas got rid of all your opponent's G-Guards and all your PGs, and now Zoa is a free win. But if all of that is gone, Katrina is also a free win. So, you know, Zoa, a 1, a 0, I don't know, it's not all that necessary. And then the progenitor, again, if you're not striding Katrina, what are you doing? You can't even get damage denied, so what's the point, really? Maybe if Gridora is weirdly locking you out in some way, and then you want a free stride to keep on playing longer. That is so fringe, though, I don't know about that. I would put that progenitor at like a 2, maybe a 1 of necessity. So, you know, those were all the clans that aren't token Granblue. I hope this kind of clears up for you whether or not you need a Zeroth Dragon for your deck. As you can see, most decks don't really need them. Going over it one more time, which decks want their Zeroth Dragon? Absolutely. I would say Royal Paladin, Angel Feather, Gold Paladin, Nubatama, Pale Moon, Granblue, Mega Colony, Great Nature. Everyone else doesn't really care all that much. And then progenitors, most decks just don't need them. They're nice to haves. You know, in the 5% of games where they may matter. It's probably even less than 5%. So that was it for today. Hope you found this interesting. Do stay subscribed to this channel. Also, go follow me on Twitch. Link is in the description. With all of this stuff going around these days, maybe I'll start streaming quite a bit. I don't know. We'll see. I will see you soon. Ciao.